Shihoko Gerto with the Wilson Center's Asia program. For those of you who find yourself at the Wilson Center for the first time, including our speaker, welcome. The center was established in 1968 as an act of Congress, and we are a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who remains the only American president with a PhD. We are strictly nonpartisan, which I believe is something that we must cherish deeply at these times. The IMF World Bank Spring meetings ended last week. At their World Economic Outlook report, they concluded that there are risks to the global economy. They downgraded their outlook for this year as well as a result. Risks include uncertainties about trade, uncertainties in Europe, and some weaknesses in the Chinese economy, etc. But in light of all of this, in spite of all of this, the outlook for Asia remains relatively stable. But that isn't to say that it is not without risk. There is significant downside pressure, not only on the macroeconomic front. There are political uncertainties. And in the world's most populous and dynamic region, it is also susceptible to natural disasters as well. Less than 24 hours ago, for instance, a volcano in Kumamoto, Japan erupted. That's only one of the risks that the region faces. So here today to talk about the many risks as well as opportunities in the economy, in the political scene, in natural disasters, is the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. We're really excited to be able to have him here to talk about the latest ADB report on the regional economy. Dr. Yasuyuki Sawada is, of course, based in Manila, and he is also a professor at the University of Tokyo's Faculty of Economics, and his research focuses on macro as well as micro development economics, microeconometrics, and the economics of disasters. You can read more about him in the handout that we've given you here today, but without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Sawada and hear his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Goto-san, for very nice introduction. I'm Yas Sawada. I got to know Wilson Center was established in 1968. Actually, ADB established in 1966, so turning into 53 years old this year, and 2 years older than Wilson Center. As you may know, Asian Development Bank, or in short, ADB, is one of the multilateral development banks. And our aim is to reduce poverty and facilitate development of Asian Pacific region. And every year we have this flagship publication titled Asian Development Outlook. Mainly, one of the purpose of Asian Development Outlook, or in short ADO, is to come up with growth forecast as well as inflation forecast and economic outlook 4 times a year, and out of 4 times, we have twice publishing reports with a thematic chapter. This time, this is the very first ADO for year 2019. So, plan of my talk is, first, I'd like to share with you Asian development or Asian economic outlook, and also little with some elaborated discussion on likely impact of trade tension between China and the US, what's the likely impact on Asian economy. So that's the second part. And then third part, I'd like to talk about thematic chapter, which is titled Strengthening Disaster Resilience. So this is an outline of today's talk. So in total, 35 minutes, I'd like to finish my presentation, and then I'm happy to have a discussion. Okay, thank you. So let me stand up and make a presentation. So before getting to details of the report, I'd like to share with you 5 key messages. First, so ADB has 46 developing member countries, actually including a newest member whose name is Niue, located nearby New Zealand. And Niue became a member of ADB last month. So we have 46 developing member countries. And although we don't have data from Niue yet, so when I refer to Asia's growth, Asia's inflation, that refers to overall average growth of 45 developing member countries. And so this time, consolidated growth of developing Asia will reach this year 5.7% and next year 5.6%. This is slightly slowing down since last year, especially second bullet point, China, largest economy in these developing members. Growth rate has been moderating this year, next year. In contrast, second largest economy, India, growth rate will accelerate this year, next year. In terms of the inflation, because of global commodity prices, food price, and oil prices stabilized at a moderate level, so we expect this year, next year's inflation rate will be 2.5%, which is well below last 10 years' average inflation rate, which is 3.2%. So overall, Asia's growth and inflation forecast and prospects seems to be quite good looking, although growth rate is slightly slowing down. Highest risk, largest risk we identify is a prolonged trade negotiation between US and China. So I'd like to briefly discuss and share with you our quantitative finding, likely impact of prolonged trade negotiation. And finally, I'd like to share with you this report's thematic chapter on disaster resilience. So medium-term and long-term risk, disaster is really affecting Asian region disproportionately if we look around the globe. So I'd like to highlight disaster by natural hazards. So let me, in detail, I'd like to discuss growth forecast. So as I mentioned, 5.7%, 5.6% this year is a consolidated developing Asian Pacific region's growth rate. This is actually a declining trend since last year and year before. But having said this, among these developing economy, 45 developing member countries, we included 4 already high-income, newly industrialized economies: Korea, Taipei, China, Hong Kong, China, as well as Singapore. And these countries became rich already. So it's natural to observe growth rate slow down. So excluding these 4 already high-income countries, consolidated growth is still more than 6%, 6.2% and 6.1%. So I think this growth rate is quite high if we compare other regions around the globe. And more than 60% of global growth is still generated by Asian Pacific region. So it's safe to say still Asia is the engine of global growth. However, we see some growth rate slowing down. What's behind this? One element is slowing down of industrial economies' growth, developed economies' growth. We track a group of 3 economies, US, Euro area, and Japan. Consolidated growth was 2.2% last year, likely to slowing down to 1.9%, 1.6%. So this is the one most important element why Asia Pacific region's growth rate is still moderating, although 6% or close to 6% growth is quite highest. And this is the behind this is a broader global economies business cycle. In order to capture global economies progress, we can pick popular measure called the PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, which is the subjective assessment of private sector decision makers. Global composite, encompassing all the sectors PMI, we see, and also here, red one is a composite PMI global, and blue one is a manufacturing PMI covering a global economy. We can see year 2017 and up until first half of 2018, PMI is having a positive trend. Okay, so global economy has been expanding up until middle last year, and then after middle of last year, this PMI trend tilted downwards. And similarly, world trade volume shown in the green line has been a positive and quite expansionary pattern up until middle last year, and then after that we see a shrinkage, and almost no global trade expansion seems to stop. And in the middle, we see the progress of US-China trade tension. So although this global business cycle is a natural consequences of a product cycle, semiconductor cycle, but also coincide with some progress in the trade measures. So because of this global cycle, Asia economy was also affected. Left is export growth and right is import growth. Both growth pattern, export and import, again, year 2017 up until middle 2018, we saw export expansion, import expansion. After that, import and export and both export and import shrunk and became growth rate moderated and became almost 0% growth. So expansion of trade of Asia seems to stop. Became a steady state. So global business cycle seems to play a key role behind this moderation of Asian growth slowdown. But having said this, I'd like to emphasize current Asian economy's growth is driven more by domestic element, domestic consumption, and also investment, rather than external demand. In order to illustrate this, here I show major Asian and Pacific economies, growth rate 2017 and GDP growth rate 2018, shown in red dots, yellow dots, decompose in terms of demand side. Okay, and we can see orange part really play a key role to support growth rate, which is a domestic consumption, followed by a gray part, which is a public and private investment. So really domestic element or factors, domestic consumption, investment, really play a key role to support Asian growth rate, including China left end, more than 60% domestic consumption. India, second largest, also more than 60% growth is driven by domestic consumption. So this is the important point I'd like to highlight. So now let's talk about the sub-regional pattern. Top left is East Asia. East Asia grows 6.0% last year, will slow down 5.7, 5.5 this year, next year. Mainly driven by China's growth moderation, 6.6 last year, 6.3, 6.1 this year, next year. And China is the largest economy, and also other East Asian countries, the economy well connected through supply chain network with China. So overall growth moderation we're going to observe this year, next year. Southeast Asia, similar pattern this year, slightly slowing down growth because of a global business cycle. But next year, we predict growth will pick up again, up to 5.0%, mainly due to trade redirection effect. Mainly, or one of the reasons behind this is Chinese export slowdown to the US seems to be captured by other Southeast Asian countries. So this trade redirection effect seems to kick in next year and pushing up overall Southeast Asia's growth. Philippines will show strong growth rate this year, mainly driven by very strong domestic public investment in infrastructure. Now, top right is South Asia. South Asia is the fastest growing region, and overall growth rate will accelerate 6.7 to 6.8 this year and 6.9 next year. And the largest economy in South Asia, India, will growth rate will accelerate, mainly due to the domestic consumption, domestic investment. Bangladesh will reach 8.0% growth, which is really amazing high growth and highest among the Asian economy. And this fast growth will continue next year also. Central Asia growth will slowing down, mainly due to largest economy in this sub-region, Kazakhstan's growth rate slowing down because of oil price decline. Kazakhstan is oil producing country as well as exporting country. So mainly due to oil price, Kazakhstan growth rate slowing down. So Central Asia overall growth also slowing down. Pacific region growth rate last year was quite low, 0.9%, mainly due to largest economy in this sub-region, PNG, encounter earthquake a year ago, and natural gas production exports negatively affected last year. But this year, we see a strong reconstruction, rehabilitation of natural gas sector, PNG. So PNG growth will bounce back above 3% this year, next year. So overall Pacific growth will going up. Yeah. So these are sub-regional picture. So now I'd like to talk about largest economy, China and also India. As I said, Chinese growth moderating this year and next year. But this is the on long-term slowing down trend. Okay? So there are two elements. One is the medium-term and long-term reasons behind this growth moderation of China, and short-term. Okay? Long-term, it's natural for a country which successfully moving up from low income to middle income and then aiming at the high income, already rich country, it's natural to observe growth rate slowing down. China used to grow at the rate of 10% or so. You cannot continue even if after reaching a middle income, the upper middle income. So this is the same pattern we observe in the US, European countries, as well as Japan and other high-income Asian countries. And China actually has been taking the same route, and we also observe China is successfully rebalancing or transforming its economy from export demand-driven to more domestic demand-driven, and also manufacturing-led economy into service sector-led economy to fulfill the demand by already rich Chinese people. So here, one illustration is growth share or growth contribution of manufacturing sector shown in blue, shrinking over time. And then in contrast, service sector showing this orange part is gradually increasing. So this rebalancing of economy or transformation of economy is one critical factor explaining a slowing down of China, Chinese growth. Second is rather a medium-term or short-term reason behind this slowing down is Chinese government put heading of financial instability or financial risks as a very top priority of economic policy. Growth acceleration is one of the priorities, but not really top priority. So that's why we can see it's natural to observe growth rate is moderating. In fact, the Chinese government is committed to tighten regulation and control shadow banking. And we see shadow banking size is sharply declining in last 1 year or so. And also broader measure of loan size, total social financing shown in red is also declining. So commitment of the Chinese government to control financial instability seems to be really materializing. So next, the second largest economy, India. As I said, India growth rate will be accelerating. Again, there are medium-term or long-term factor. Indian government engaged a major policy reform, demonetization of its high-valued currency a couple of years ago, and also introduction of goods and service tax, consolidating sort of unbalanced tax regime and unified at national level. So this major reform seems to generate growth momentum. And also, as I already briefly mentioned, demand side, consumption, domestic consumption. Blue is private consumption, and orange is government consumption. Domestic consumption is the largest contributor to support growth, followed by investment, shown in gray part. So domestic demand seems to play a key role. And policy rate of central bank lowered, interest rate lowered, so that stimulates more investment. And also this year, government will introduce income support program for agriculture sector, so that will boost domestic consumption. Overall, we expect growth rate will goes up because of the these stimulus of domestic demand. And Purchasing Manager Index, again, subjective assessment of business decision maker, also show an upward trend. And this is consistent with our view of upgrading growth rate. In terms of inflation, food price index fluctuated a little bit, but now we expect food price will stabilize at the moderate level. And also, oil price in red fluctuated a lot, but in last few years, it's upward trend. Although long term, it's slowing down, going down. But a few years, we see upward trend. And last year, end of last year, we saw a sharp drop. And then oil price seems to stabilize at the moderate level this year. So because of these two major component of prices stabilized this year, next year, we set 2.5% inflation rate this year and next year. And as I said, this is well below past 10 years average of 3.2%. So inflation expectations were well under control, unlike other regions around the globe. So overall picture of Asia, growth rate continue with some slight slowdown, and the inflation expectation prices are quite well stabilized. So what's the source of potential risk? Here, we identify 4 sources of risk. Number one is US-China trade negotiation still continue. So uncertainty over settlement is one greater risk. And secondly, due to a global business cycle or other reasons, developed economies growth rate and Chinese economic growth rate, if slowing down at a faster speed than our prior expectation, that will generate negative spillover effect to other Asian economies. Thirdly, US Fed interest rate hike or monetary policy normalization has been paused for a while. But there is a risk still risk when and how monetary policy normalization will be resumed. Not only U.S. Government, but also European country and other developed economies may change monetary policy position. So uncertainty around monetary policy of developed economy is also another source of risk. And finally, medium term, as I will explain later on, Asian Pacific region has been affected by different type of disasters triggered by natural hazards disproportionately. So this medium-term risk is really a challenge for Asia to continue growth momentum. So these are the 4 sources of risk. And I'd like to devote 5 minutes or so talking about US-China trade tension. So basically, I'd like to share with you our technical study, what's the likely impact on Asian economy arising from US-China trade conflict. So this is a chronology of US-China trade conflict. Currently, from China to US, around $250 billion or a little bit more that scale of export exposed to U.S. trade measure, I mean tariff measures, roughly, depending on the different goods and services, roughly 10% or so tariff measure. And then from U.S. to China, 110 billion US dollars or so equivalent exports exposed to Chinese tariff measures. Again, 10% of tariff or so. So this is a current scenario. And then escalation scenario is all the goods and services traded bilaterally between US and China will face 25% tariff on both sides. That's an escalation scenario. And then a third scenario on the table is the worst case scenario. In addition to all the goods and services bilaterally traded between US-China, 25 tariff, US government may impose, regardless of origin, 25% tariff on auto and auto products. So that's the worst case scenario. So three scenarios we quantify what's the likely impact on Asian economy. And because US and China and Germany are three core of global value chain or supply chain network, so this is the figure based on the actual trade data. And US and China entered in mutual trade measures that will definitely decrease, cut US-China bilateral trade. And that will not only affect the US and China, but also other economies through tightly connected supply chain network. So we'd like to quantify what's the overall impact of trade conflict. So expressly, we would like to quantify three mechanisms of effects. One is the direct impact of tariff. Chinese export will goes down because of tariff measures. Okay, and so for example, smartphone export from China to the US will goes down because after tariff price will goes up. So smartphone production accordingly decline in China. That's a direct impact. Then suppliers and the parts makers for smartphone will indirectly affected, negatively affected. That's an indirect effect through production linkage or supply chain network. Supplier may be located within China or other Asian economy. So this indirect effect can generate a negative spillover effect across the national border. Third one is because Chinese export of smartphones slowing down to the US, other Asian countries can export more smartphones. So that's a trade redirection effect, and presumably this is a positive impact. So in order to quantify this, we need a data which really captures input-output linkages of different sectors and different industries. And so luckily, or fortunately, we have ADB has a multi-regional input-output table which is connected across the national border. So it's a very ideal data to describe these three channels. And again, three scenario we quantify: current scenario, bilateral escalation scenario, worst case scenario. So this is the result for global GDP. Let's confine our attention to right chart. Right chart consolidated three different effects: direct effect, indirect effect through supply chain network, and third, trade redirection effect. Under current scenario continue 2 or 3 years, overall global GDP growth will slow down by 0.05 percentage point. Okay. Escalation scenario, bilateral escalation scenario, worst case scenario, roughly minus 0.01 percentage point world growth rate decline, or 0.25 percentage point world growth GDP growth will decline. So I think these are definitely negative, but the magnitude seems to be rather limited, especially under current scenario. Magnitude is almost close to 0. How about China and the US? For China, if current scenario continue 2-3 years, Chinese growth rate will slow down by 0.25 percentage point spread over 2-3 years. So single year probably a tick decline of Chinese growth rate if current status quo will continue. Bilateral escalation and the worst case scenario, overall 1 percentage point Chinese GDP decline, again spread over 2-3 years. Single year, maybe 0.3 percentage point decline of Chinese GDP growth, and escalation scenario. US, so these effects are negative, but almost zero for the US. Okay. So these are the picture for global economy, China, and the US. Overall, I would say, actual impact of ongoing trade tension is quite limited, even under escalation scenario. So let's move on to impact on Asia. So this is under current scenario. If current status quo continue 2-3 years, then so this blue bar chart shows the first two effects, direct effect and indirect effect through supply chain network. Presumably this supposed to be negative, and indeed it's negative. PRC and US we have already seen, and global GDP we have already seen. Direct and indirect effect seems to be negative. So this is Japan and developing Asia excluding PRC and other major Asian economy. So all the economy will encounter negative spillover effect through supply chain network. Okay. But now let's add trade redirection effect. That's supposed to be positive. Okay. So this orange part is trade redirection effect. So almost all the economy in Asia will gain out of trade redirection effect. So Chinese exports slow down, will be captured by different Asian economy, including Japan. Okay. So trade redirection effect is positive. And then negative spillover effect, indirect effect. Total effect is shown in a red diamond here, and the total effect seems to be positive, almost all Asian economies. Having said this, magnitude is almost zero. Even the largest beneficiary, Vietnam, over 3 years, total gain, net gain to GDP growth rate is 0.004 percentage point. So single year GDP growth rate will increase 0.001 percentage point, which is almost zero. Okay. So this is under current scenario. But the escalation scenario, probably we will observe a magnified picture. So negative spillover effect will be expanded, but the positive trade redirection effect will be expanded. So let's look at the worst case scenario. Okay. So indeed, we see worst case scenario, all the bilateral trade between US-China, 25% tariff measures imposed, plus auto and auto parts, US imposed, regardless of origin of auto and auto parts. So Asian economy, so negative indirect spillover effect is quite large. However, a positive trade redirection effect will dominate, for example, in Vietnam, total impact will be 2 percentage point increase of GDP over 2-3 years. So 0.7% GDP growth rate increase or something like that. Okay. Japan is intriguing case. Although Japan, we saw current scenario slightly positive, almost zero, but slightly positive impact under current scenario. But now, if auto and auto parts measures are imposed, then net effect of Japan is a negative. So, these are the picture. But having said this, this is the under current scenario. So copy and paste it in previous figure. Chinese growth rate will slow down 0.25 percentage point over 2-3 years, and the Asian economy will gain. However, magnitude is almost zero. This picture little expanded vertically, but NIES and ASEAN 0.06 and 0.004 percentage point growth rate increase over 2-3 years. This is almost zero. Okay. So these are the simulation, numerical simulation based on our input-output table. In reality, is it happening? That's the next question we'd like to address. Overall, it's too early to make assessment whether our direct impact, indirect impact, and trade redirection effects are really kicking in. But we have some sign of trade redirection effect from the data. So right chart shows the overall FDI inflow to developing Asia by source country, supplier of FDI. 2017 to 2018, we see a big jump, particularly China on top of this bar chart, orange. Chinese FDI investment from China to other Asian economy really increased a lot and roughly tripled, 189% increase. Okay. And even US shown in here, US FDI increased by 70%. And FDI increase seems to support trade redirection effect is already happening through relocation of a production site. And sector-wise, because we have an input table, we have a sector disaggregation. Again, under current scenario, Chinese GDP growth rate will slow down 0.25 percentage point. And different sectors affect more or less similar manner negatively. Blue is the electronics sector. So this sector's production export to the US will go down. And actually, this production shrinkage in China seems to be captured by ASEAN 5 countries and NIES. So this is the ingredient of a trade redirection effect. We can also quantify using our data. All the simulation results and also sector-specific impact and country-specific impacts, all the data are now posted on ADB website. So if you are interested in, for example, Bangladesh, whether gain or lose, actually Bangladesh will gain, especially apparel and ready-made garment industry. Exports seems to increase and production will increase, so Bangladesh seems to gain. So if you are interested in, please visit our website. But this simulation exercise, we didn't really look into impact of expectation change. Actually, people's expectation, producers and investors' sentiment and consumer sentiment, maybe pessimistic expectation may fulfill. Self-fulfilling pessimism is one concern. So in order to capture how uncertainty and pessimism can affect actual growth rate, we constructed a trade policy uncertainty measure using text search and text mining of newspaper articles. This is for China. So China-US trade conflict, trade tension, and trade risk, etc., etc. We set particular keywords, and then we searched keywords. And based on the frequency of keywords hits, we constructed a consolidated measure of trade policy uncertainty. Trade policy measure uncertainty is highest right now. And we can trace back 1995 when US PRC had an intellectual property rights tension that we see a spike. And also when China joined WTO, we see another spike. But level of uncertainty is highest. And using this past uncertainty measure and also match with the actual investment, business investment measure, we can uncover what's the impact of uncertainty on business investment, which is shown in the right figure. Investment will go down if tension increase, especially first 4 quarters or 1 year. Roughly speaking, average trade tension, 1 percentage point decline of investment. So actually this uncertainty and change in expectation seems to generate a tangible impact on investment and production and also slowing down of growth. So this is one particular concern, the largest concern we posted in our Asian Development Outlook. So now, how am I doing in terms of time? Maybe I talk too much. Maybe 5 minutes. So same chapter, we can discuss later on. So briefly, I'd like to mention as a medium-term risk disaster triggered by natural hazard. As you may know, many reports and many data, many statistics endorse Asia and Pacific region disproportionately affected by different type of disaster. Hydrometeorological disasters such as typhoon, cyclone, floods, and also droughts, geological disaster, earthquake, and also earthquake triggered tsunami, biological disaster, epidemics, and pandemics, and maybe you vividly remember 2003 SARS epidemic in Asia. So these different type of disaster disproportionately affecting Asia. And in terms of number of victims or affected people, globally, out of 5 victims of different type of disaster, 4 people living in Asia. So more than 80% of disaster victims actually resided in Asia. So that highlights disproportionate impact of disaster to Asia. And also high-profile disaster, we vividly remember 2004, Indian Ocean tsunami, December 2004, killed more than 200,000 people. And also 2008, Sichuan earthquake in China killed almost 90,000 people. So high-profile disasters we can really find everywhere in Asia. Economic losses, there is a technical way to quantify accurately. And we did economic loss estimate, and this is called the average annual losses. And we compute economic losses divided by GDP or divided by asset size of each country. So we can classify loss exposure of different countries. So left chart, Asia and Pacific region, low income and high income. Low income is particularly encountering large losses if we compare with economic size or asset size. Sub-region, Pacific region is disproportionately affected by encounter big economic loss if we compare loss size to economic size. So we can say Asia and Pacific region, low-income country and small size country are really affected by natural disaster disproportionately. So we need to capture what's the mechanism behind disaster damages. And then we can set proper policy intervention. Disaster is generated by hazards. So wind speed, so high wind speed is a hazard. And often this is beyond human control. And exposure. So if you are living in an area hit by a high wind speed, then you will encounter some losses. Okay? But if you are living in a very well-structured building, then you are okay. So third factor is a vulnerability or resilience. Okay? So hazard, exposure, and vulnerability or resilience, product of these 3 elements will generate human losses and damage to assets, physical damage, and also losses of financial assets. So this is a direct impact of disaster. And then indirectly losing a job, you lose economic opportunity, long-term income loss. That's an indirect impact. Also, in this report, we particularly highlighted spillover effect through time dimension and also across time. Through time dimension, one generation hit by earthquake and lose everything. Then children of this generation will suffer from poverty. So poverty trap seems to be generated by disaster. Okay. So this is a time dimension. Space also, for example, 2011 Thai floods affecting Ayutthaya Industrial Park really affected concentrated hard drive industry in Ayutthaya. So shortly after, global hard drive price hiked, and this increase in prices of inputs will negatively affect through supply chain network. So across space, supply chain network, or people forced to move from one place to another, across space, spillover effects of disaster. That's a very important and critical element. So in order to soften this chain of disaster impact, it's critical to strengthen disaster resilience. That's the main issue we tackle in this report. There are three key elements of disaster resilience. First, the mainstreaming disaster risk reduction, which is already formalized by 2015 Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction as the international disaster strategy. Core part, there are a few elements, but one important thing is disaster risk resilience, like investment, disaster resilient infrastructure. That's one part, but these investments in disaster risk reduction should be carefully incorporated or embedded into medium-term and long-term development plan. That's very important, so that disaster reduction, risk reduction investment can generate multiple dividends. For example, cyclone shelter constructed in Bangladesh, that is for resilience against a cyclone exposure and vulnerability. But the cyclone shelter can be also used as a classroom in normal time, and also community meetings in normal time. So this investment in disaster risk reduction can facilitate human capital investment and also social capital investment, so that generating a long-term development gain. And also, all the discussion on risk resilience highlighting necessity of shifting from ex-post reconstruction to more prevention, because gain out of ex-ante infrastructure investment way higher than cost effectiveness of ex-post rehabilitation and reconstruction. Indeed, many Asian economies are shifting from ex-post reconstruction to more focusing on ex-ante prevention and preparedness, but still there's a room for shifting, more weights on before part. And the second key element to building up resilience is disaster risk financing. Big disaster international assistance needed. World Bank and ADB has a special contingent credit line for disaster-affected countries, and also grant assistance from donors and partners, including ADB, play a key role. Small risk, high-frequency small risk can be handled by government and people and also firms within each country. But middle range, there's a huge room to develop and nurture disaster insurance market mechanism. According to the data from reinsurance company, since 1980, only 8% of overall economic damage caused by different types of disaster are covered by insurance. Only 8%. That means that more than 90% of disaster losses are uncovered by insurance. So this highlights really missing disaster insurance market. Indeed, we see some unique disaster insurance products popping up, especially in South Asia and microinsurance, particularly things called rainfall index insurance or rainfall risk transfer schemes. But in terms of size and also in terms of sustainability, we cannot really, we see a huge room for elaboration. And so this is a final slides. And third key element of building up resilience is ex-post, building back better. Building back better, not only in terms of building resilience, but also broader development, continued development outcome. Building up better, but you need beforehand investment. Okay, so planning and framework to make building back better. Building back better, you need to care about speed, but not only speed, but also safety and also inclusion of poor community and poor group and disadvantaged group, and also expanding a medium-term and long-term benefit. So we should care both speed as well as a multi-faceted dividend, so that not only resilience, but also income and livelihood can be sustained over time. So this is a building back better concept already incorporated into 2015 Sendai Framework. So these are key messages. I won't repeat again, but 5 key messages included in this Asian Development Outlook report this time. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Dr. Sada, thank you very much for that very rich presentation. We don't have a lot of time, but I actually have a lot of questions about trade redirection, but I'm going to leave that aside and talk about Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific strategy and how these competing initiatives are looking into investing in the region. They're focused on infrastructure development. Could it benefit more by focusing on issues like disaster relief?
Yeah.
That's
So 2 years ago, we did a special report and special study how much Asian Pacific region needed to continue a growth trend and also poverty reduction momentum, as well as help achieve a global climate goal, Paris Agreement, in mitigation and adaptation. According to our estimate, 1.7 trillion US dollars per year, that level of investment is needed. And some significant part is climate change adaptation and mitigation. Climate change is related to a hazard, a frequency of hazard increase, and also adaptation is actually almost equivalent to building up resilience. So really, this amount of investment is needed, $1.7 trillion per year. However, actual investment is around 1 trillion US dollars or slightly less than 1 trillion US dollars in Asian Pacific region. So 0.8 trillion or 0.7 trillion US dollars, that investment should be fulfilled either by expanding a public investment of each country or tapping a private sector. And unfortunately, multilateral development bank like ADB, direct support or direct financing scale is quite limited. So I think this is quite important related to Goto-san's question, how to fulfill in this gap. So in this sense, I think very important thing is how to tap a private investment. We have this investment gap in Asia, so we need money. And this is the highest growing region, so potentially we have many good projects generating a high return. Yeah. On the other hand, global sovereign fund, also asset, and there's a pension fund. There's a big amount of assets available. But somehow, right now, we don't see any significant inflow or reallocation of available resources flowing into promising Asia investment. So eliminating a binding constraint of this flow is quite important. Basically, risk perception of Asia. Asian investments are high return. However, it's not necessarily risk-free, or rather high risk. So the risking of Asian investment seems to be overall important. Of course, ADB or other multilateral development bank can reduce perceived risk by providing a credit guarantee or other guarantee, etc., etc. But still, it's not sufficient. So in this respect, the broader initiative of Chinese government, if this is really contributing a de-risking, also financing in a sustainable manner, then I think that's a really important initiative, especially identifying projects which can generate sustainable return, also complying with safeguard policy, and also transparent procurement and transparent investment. If these are satisfied, I think this is a welcome initiative.
Thank you. Questions? We have a couple of hands up. Why don't I take them all together? So 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Okay. We have a microphone.
Thank you very much. Sherry Goodman, I'm a senior fellow here. Thank you for an excellent presentation, and thank you for organizing this. My question is, how would you characterize China's approach to strengthening disaster resilience as you've described it both within China and in the region. Is it, do you think it's part of the Belt and Road Initiative concept, separate from it? And given the importance and as you mentioned, the sort of growing importance of disaster risks and the need for resilience, do you see this as a focal point of China's long-term strategy in the region?
Let's take the second one.
Is that me?
Yes, that's you.
So my question is, so I work in insurance. I work for the state insurance regulators. So here in the U.S., insurance is regulated at the state level. So we've been partnering with FEMA, and it's really about education for consumers. And we found, when you talk about insurance, we found that it's really sad the amount of people that purchase flood insurance, for example. And then when there's a disaster, they have nothing because they didn't have the insurance. And we found with FEMA, if you just wait to get the disaster money, that's like $4,000. If you had a flood insurance policy, it's about $110,000. But we have a real problem here in the U.S. about convincing consumers to buy flood insurance or other types of insurance. So I'm just curious if you encounter that as well.
And then thirdly,
So Wada-san, very good to see you. Thanks for your presentation, which I've had the benefit of receiving on the board of the Asian Development Bank over the years. My name is Mike Strauss, and I'm a partner at a local law firm here. My question is also about China. You rightly said that the moderation in China's growth is to be expected by all macroeconomic models, but you've done a great job in other areas of decomposing the components of growth that you expect for the region, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more detail about the the decomposition of the moderation in growth in China. On the one side, as you mentioned, there's been quite a lot of attention to the success with which China has been able to shift from a investment and export-led growth model, as you mentioned, to a services and consumption-led growth model. But I'm wondering if that has a structural component that is part of the process of moderating China's growth, or if you see more of the effect coming from the two other factors, which are the beginning of a moderation of credit growth in China, which nonetheless, as you showed in slide 9, there are still quite high numbers for annual growth in credit as a result of the changes in regulation and also the trade effects that you mentioned as well. So which is more dominant?
okay, then one final question here.
Thank you. As you have shown, the U.S.-China trade disputes have negative consequences for the global economy and more for China than for the U.S. But at the same time, it's creating opportunities for the rest of Asian countries. So the trade redirection is a positive thing for Asia. So how would you weigh the overall impacts, the interaction between these two forces? So because it's like Asia is getting profits, or to some extent, it's a good thing for Asia as a region, but it has also a global downside. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Very good questions. And first one is about China's role in disaster resilience. Chinese government in general, from the viewpoint of ADB's support for Chinese government, continue to engage. We see a lot of demand for climate resilient investment. And so kind of high-level technology they are interested in, and also environmental protection they are interested in. So in that sense, broadly speaking, China is really engaging or requesting more support for disaster, broadly speaking, disaster resilience-related investment. So I think this is a good kind of direction Chinese government is engaging. Also, I'm not so much knowledge about the actual disaster operation or post-disaster operation of Chinese government, but I see any disaster events, especially Sichuan earthquake in 2008, Chinese government play a very important role to allocating large amount of necessary resources quickly. So I think that's kind of a top-down approach of China, really working well onset of disaster. So I think we need to learn more about the Chinese style of emergency operation. Insurance demand is very important. We are a little slow in supporting disaster insurance program, but we just started supporting rainfall index type of rainfall risk transfer program in Bangladesh, and it has been known using careful impact evaluation methods called randomized control trial and other methods. These seemingly or theoretically ideal insurance program demand has been very low, and so I think it's too early to make assessment of our ADB supported insurance product in Bangladesh, but still I think there is a problem how to stimulate more participation. And I'm originally from Japan. Japan had a big nationwide earthquake insurance program for homeowners, and we see after Kobe earthquake in 1995, participation rate increased, and also after March 11 tsunami and earthquake and tsunami disaster, we see overall participation rate earthquake insurance increase. But overall participation rate is as low as, I think, lower than 40%. So more than 60% of homes are uncovered by earthquake insurance. So that also indicates there is some behavioral elements, people's psychology and probability assessment leading to maybe optimistic decision about disaster. So I think this is also related to argument whether earthquake or disaster insurance should be mandatory or voluntary basis. I think New Zealand had a mandatory earthquake insurance program, and after the earthquake, it worked very well. So I think although it's not simple, we should support a mandatory earthquake insurance program, but I think this is an issue we need to really tap. And also we can learn from behavioral economics why people do not participate in seemingly viable and good program. Okay. But this is a very important question. So Mike's question is about the structural transformation of China. So I think once people became rich enough, then the room for income increase will getting smaller and smaller. And also, once people get rich enough, their consumption pattern will expand horizontally. Not only basic, household appliances, but people started consuming wide variety of services. So I think what we see in China is really overall Chinese people became middle income and started consume really a wide range of products. So I think this is kind of inevitable consequences of people getting rich. So I think this is a structure we have in our mind. Yeah. And last question is about trade redirection benefit and also Chinese spillover effect, direct spillover effect from China. Actually, can I clarify your, yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I see. So in general, I think Asia Pacific region is number one beneficiary of post-World War II free trade and free investment regime. So I think Asia's growth is really driven by this goods and services and foreign direct investment, indirect investments, free flow across border. So I think it's very important to emphasize continued, openness and also lowering tariff and eliminating unnecessary trade measures. So in that sense, So we see this bilateral trade tension on one hand, but on the other hand, we see comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, already became ineffective, covering a big number of people and big economic size. RCEP is also progressing forward, covering global 30% global GDP and a large population. So I think in general, these free trade and also expansion of free trade system so that the Asian economy can grow. So in other words, I think this is very important to emphasize this trade regime should be continued. Free trade regime or free economic system should be really continued.
So, and in the meantime, the United States continues to have a number of bilateral trade negotiations, not just with China, but with other countries, including Japan as well. We could really continue this conversation about trade relations, about resiliency to natural disasters, but I'm afraid we've actually already gone over time. So if you could please join me in thanking Dr. Saad, and thank you very much for joining us today.